nonetheless some suggestions of a glimmer of hope. Generally speaking, in New York, the governor says the curve may be flattening, Lenny, but now you hear, as Yamiche just mentioned, new hotspots in Baltimore, Philadelphia, D.C. What does that tell you about how this virus is spreading?
Like any outbreak, the virus spreads irregularly. It doesn't smoothly move across the country. It hopscotches. It's an opportunistic virus. If, there's a gathering here or a church service there or a party there, it can break out in any place. The good news, as Dr. Birx so well put it, is that social distancing works. We, and I bet even the experts, have been pleasantly surprised at how well Americans are observing the social distancing restrictions, and it is starting to have an impact. Now, we're a long, long way from having quelled the virus, but that is a bit of very encouraging news.
The other big story this week, of course, are the historic number of Americans who are out of work. 6.6 million Americans filed for jobless claims last week. That means in the next over 2 years, Jillian, this is the kind of a sudden halt to the U.S. economy. It really has no precedent.
It absolutely has no precedent. And what's happening right now with the coronavirus is first and foremost a tremendous medical tragedy, but the economic shock is extraordinary as well. And unfortunately, a rash of surveys came out this week that suggests it's only going to get worse in the coming weeks. People are talking about the unemployment rate beating, potentially, the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that raises very big questions, not just about the extraordinary human toll and the suffering that's occurring, but the knock-on impacts going forward on things like the mortgage market, on retailers, and all the other areas of the economy.
Right. And as you say, economists bracing for 20 million Americans out of work by the end of the month. I mean, that would push unemployment toward 15%, which is astonishing to think that in February, such a short time ago, unemployment was at 3.5% with 113 straight months of job growth, Jillian.
Absolutely. And I hate to say it, but those are some of the more optimistic projections. There are even gloomier projections which suggesting even higher unemployment numbers. Now, the good news is that the American government is scrambling, racing to try and counteract this huge shock, both through the very dramatic measures unveiled this week through the Federal Reserve, but also through efforts like trying to give loans to small businesses to keep people employed. And the scale of response has been almost as stunning as the actual economic shock. The bad news, though, is that no one actually knows whether it's going to work fast enough. And at the moment, the omens aren't looking good.
So let's talk about that, Yamiche. The federal government, of course, has launched this $2.3 trillion program to try to stop the bleeding with the economy in free fall this week. The Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, asked Congress to replenish the $350 billion small business program because it's simply being overwhelmed by demand. But, as I read it, $250 billion was denied. This is all stalled in Congress. What's going on?
Well, Congress is really still negotiating how Democrats and Republicans are going to come to a place where both parties feel like they agree on what should be done. Both parties, though, sources tell me, are interested, of course, in helping small businesses and helping Americans deal with this economic tragedy, which is what it really has turned into. What I will say is that there was this really robust debate among Democrats and Republicans long before this pandemic about what role the federal government should play. And Republicans were the ones that were usually into talking about private companies and philanthropy helping people. And Democrats were the ones who would say it's the government that the government needs to be the backstop for people's lives. I think that debate has been settled. Everyone's decided the government needs to help people. So as a result, we're going to see billions of dollars, possibly trillions of dollars more go into helping people as people face this uncertain future.
Right, and lots of people still waiting for their help from the government. We had a lot of listeners leave us voicemails. Here's one from William in Appaloosa, Louisiana. He said he lost his job as a prep cook in New Orleans.
A lady in the United Way who's wonderful helped me out. She got me a little bit of food. And she got me a tent. So I'm living in a tent in the woods I have no information on when I'm going to get assistance from the government. This is going on the 4th week now that I've lost wages. I am homeless, and it's just a horrible situation. And I am running out of options. I'm running out of food, and we really need some help out here.
Jillian, the most vulnerable among us are suffering the most, and the American safety net, to be honest, wasn't meant to catch so many millions of people at once. Jillian, many people are still waiting for their check from the government.
Absolutely. And recordings like that are absolutely heartbreaking for all of us, particularly anyone who's lucky enough to be listening to that from the comfort of their own home, which is what I'm doing. The reality is that American safety net was very, very full of holes even before this crisis started. Unfortunately, the crisis is exposing all the holes. Or if you like, it's like a very strong wind, which is revealing all the cracks in a household. And the consequences are absolutely brutal. The government is scrambling to try and create more and more programs to respond. At last count, there are 11 different programs coming out of the Federal Reserve and Treasury, each of which have got their own acronyms. It's really acronym soup. But looking at it is a bit like, a game of whack-a-mole. No sooner does one problem emerge, then the government jumps in and then another one emerges. Or it's a bit like that boy trying to put his finger in the dike to stop the flood coming across Holland. It's really engaged in a race against time, and it's very unclear whether the infrastructure is in place in terms of the social safety net, or even the political accord is in place to.
Of course, on one hand, but the real tension, thinking about a possible another wave of this virus if social distancing is relaxed. So, this give and take that people are trying to figure out, Lenny.
Exactly. We finally have achieved some progress against this virus, and all the scientists are saying that this is no time to back off, that we are now in position to get past this, but we are not past it. We're not close to past it. I want to point out that while the coasts have seen the coronavirus and sort of a lot of what it has to throw against us, the middle of the country has not yet really experienced that. The virus is moving in from the coasts. So if we were to open up the middle of the country, we might do it even before the virus brings its worst to those places.
Rural America is next, no question about it. It is our Week in the News Roundtable. A great panel, Lenny Bernstein, Yamiche Alcindor, and Jillian Tett. Stick with me. We'll be right back. I'm Jane Clayson. This is On Point.
Support for On Point comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston. From Carbonite, working to protect small businesses from ransomware attacks. Carbonite can help businesses recover computer files without paying a ransom. Learn more at carbonite.com. And WBUR, presenting the storytelling podcast for kids, Circle Round. Thoughtfully selected folk tales from around the world, adapted for today's families. That's Circle Round. Available on Apple Podcasts.
This is On Point. I'm Jane Clayson. It's our Week in Review with a great panel this hour. Yamiche Alcindor with PBS NewsHour, Lenny Bernstein of The Washington Post, and Jillian Tett from The Financial Times. Here's some sound of an ICU nurse in New York City being interviewed by CNN on Thursday.
Everyone has the same thing. the patients keep coming. There's more death. There's more of that. So yeah, emotionally, there's a lot of anxiety. But my colleagues and I, we talk to each other, we joke around, we really try and like keep it together. But yeah, it is definitely an anxious time.
Takes an emotional toll and a physical toll as well. Lenny Bernstein, let me start with you here. The president is talking about, opening the country. At some point, we have to start again, right, and reopen the economy. He says he wants to reopen with a big bang sooner rather than later, and who's to say when that is? But one big obstacle for opening the economy is that the administration has yet to figure out how to expand testing for COVID-19 nationwide. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said this week that testing is going to be, quote, the bridge to the new economy. And yet the federal government this week announced it will end funding for coronavirus testing sites. And so I'm wondering, Lenny, what's the future of testing in this country?
Well, think about yourself going back to work. Are you going to be confident when you have to go back into a group setting if you don't know that the people around you have been tested for the virus and that they don't have it and that they can't be tested regularly? I don't think anybody's going to be real confident about that. Even though we will be going back slowly and some of us will still be working from home and there'll be greater distancing, in all the places where we gather, we need to have some assurance that the people around us are not sick and they're not going to give it to us. So testing has to be ramped up.
And so do you think that will ultimately be left to the states now with the federal government ending its funding of coronavirus testing sites as of today nationwide?
I think it will be left up to the states and the private sector. If the federal government's going to get out, others are going to have to step in.
There are successful models, Yamiche, South Korea, Iceland, Thailand, New Zealand. They've done enough testing that they can kind of get out of their own lockdown, testing to determine who might have an antibody to the virus, who was infected and maybe was asymptomatic. I mean, testing was, is, and will be the cornerstone of this novel virus, correct?
That's right. And we had a pretty remarkable moment yesterday at the White House where the president was, the question was put to the president, don't you need a national testing system, a widespread testing system before we can reopen the government and ease social distancing guidelines? And his answer was one word, no. He said that he doesn't believe that. He says we're talking about more than 300 million people and it's just not going to happen. Of course, a couple months ago, the president said anyone who wants a test can have a test. And that just never turned out to be true. It's still not true now. We're hearing all sorts of stories of people who cannot get tested, who have symptoms, who are still not able to get access to these tests. But the president is also very focused on the fact that there are some governors, including the governor of South Carolina, who are anxious to loosen the social distancing guidelines. And he's also very cognizant of the fact that the economy is very much tied to his reelection campaign and the idea that he was going to run on the economy and run on the fact that he had this great economy before this pandemic happened. So he wants to see the economy open up with this big bang, mainly because he also wants to be able to run on that.
Well, and he's also not setting a date. I mean, he's careful not to talk about specific dates. Last time he did talk about opening the country up by Easter, obviously that didn't happen. So clearly he's torn as he tries to save lives and save the American economy, Yamiche.
That's right. But the White House sources that I've been talking to, there are the date that he's eyeing. So even though President Trump doesn't want to come out on camera and say, this is the next date that I'm looking at, he is very much eager in May to open up the economy. And I think also Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said that on CNBC this week that he is looking at May 1st as a way to possibly ease some of the guidelines. Even if it doesn't mean places like New York, it might mean other places that have not seen the level of outbreaks of that city. But we go back to this idea of testing. There are a lot of people who are asymptomatic who could be spreading the virus in places that we think are not hotspots that do in fact have high levels of transmission and spread.
So many people talking about the timing of all this when we might be able to return to the lives we once knew. Dr. Anthony Fauci was asked about that this week. Here he is on CBS talking about what Americans can expect maybe this summer.
Can you envision a summer at this point based on the models where people are going back to beaches, people are going to baseball games, weddings are happening, reunions are happening? Is that in the cards right now?
it can be in the cards, and I say that with some caution, because as I said, when we do that, when we pull back and try to open up the country, as we often use that terminology, we have to be prepared that when the infections start to rear their heads again, that we have in place a very aggressive and effective way to identify, isolate, contact trace, and make sure we don't have those spikes that we see now.
Lenny Bernstein, the CDC is talking about getting workers back on the job. I mean, that includes things like taking temperatures at work, right? Wearing masks on the job, no congregating in the kitchen or the lounge, better circulation in buildings and cleaning protocols and all the rest. I mean, from a health perspective, what are the first steps to reopening this country?
Well, I think you mentioned them. Before I get there, I just want to say another thing that Anthony Fauci said this week is that the virus is going to determine this schedule. And I think that more than whether we'll be able to go on summer vacation is the key point that he made. Yes, in other pandemics like Ebola, what they did as they started to open up is they put those protections in place. Temperature is an okay guide. There are precautions that you wouldn't normally think that you could institute at workplaces. You could make everybody, wash their hands. You could have extra cleaning of the hallways and the walls and be constantly wiping down for virus. So you can institute these things. They're not normal for us. We don't think of them, but there are things you could do if you wanted to very slowly move back into the workforce. Another one would be nobody sits within 6 feet of each other, and that's going to take some doing.
Right. The problem is, bottom line, Yamiche, is, again, testing. We don't have an aggressive testing system in this country, and certainly no contract tracing in place state by state.
That's right. And I will say that it has been something that's just existed since the beginning of this pandemic. And the president has said a lot of times that the United States is doing a lot more testing and is doing more testing than other countries. And right now, while we are doing a lot more testing than we were at the beginning, we're still not per capita testing as many people as other countries like South Korea. The other thing to note is that the president has been saying that he is very much thinking about kind of the people's lives and saying that a lot of people are anxious to go back to work. But I also think, at least based on my sources, that the president is inclined to listen to the health experts. So when the virus will determine the date that we go back, I tend to believe that the president really does lean into Dr. Fauci's assessments. And when I talk to Dr. Fauci, he says he has a really good relationship with the president. So it seems like there's some synergy there, even if the president is very eager